Chapter 6. I had to get Alice to the doctor. It was 11 o'clock at night when I decided, and our old horse was loose without hobbles and always very hard to catch. When we turned him loose, we had to walk 2.5 miles to the Winnemucca Ranch to get two cowboys to lasso him for us. I've seen them run after him for hours and try in every way to fasten a loop on him. Johnny could dodge and slip through loops with the greatest of ease and skill. The boys would cuss and call him and his ancestors all kinds of names and finally succeed in catching him after hours of hard work. When I went to AJ's bed and said, "I've got to take Alice to the doctor," it was small wonder that he gasped out, "Old lady, you're crazy. You'll never catch Johnny." "Well, I gotta go and try. I can't let this baby die without trying to get help for her." Johnny was running with a bunch of 20 gentle horses. I had glimpsed them earlier that evening feeding on a grassy flat about a half-mile from our cabin. Hoping they were still there, I started out to find them. Tying an old-fashioned apron around my waist, I filled my lap with grain and armed only with the grain and a prayer. "Oh, God, help me catch old Johnny." I walked out into the moonlight. Sure enough, the horses were still on the flat. I approached them, talking low. "Come, boys, come now, don't be afraid." I rattled the grain in my apron. At their first sight of me, they all turned and ran. I slowly followed, still talking and rattling the grain. Soon they turned and came toward me with mincing steps, snorting, their heads going up and down inquisitively, circling around and around me. I held out a handful of grain and kept on speaking to them softly. First one, then another took a taste of the grain as I held it out in my hand. Then they all crowded around me, trying to get a handful of the grain. All the while, Johnny was sneaking along in the background. Had he seen a rope, he would never have come near me. Seeing none, he came up from behind, put his head over my shoulder, and ate grain from my lap. I reached around with my free hand, untied my apron strings, and slipped them around his neck. I stood there letting him finish the grain and led him home. Any kind of string would hold him once he knew he was caught. I believe that was the only time he was ever caught without a wild chase, but it was also the only time he was ever caught with a prayer. It took some time to get hitched up. Then I had to make Alice's bed in the wagon and put up a lunch for myself. It was 2 a.m. when I loaded my sick baby into the wagon. I kissed AJ goodbye and started out with many misgivings. I wondered if I was doing right. What if AJ should die with Edson too sick to hold up his head and only 8-year-old Jessie to take care of things? What would she do? It would frighten her to death if Daddy passed away. All these and many other troubled thoughts went through my mind. Why, I began to wonder, why had I undertaken such a thing? Why had I thought I was so smart? Why had I thought I could do what everyone told me couldn't be done? Why hadn't I listened to them? With all these self-condemning thoughts, I drove the mile down to the gate that opened into the county road. As I closed the heavy gate, I was facing our cabin outlined so clearly in the moonlight. It was then I had to truly decide whether to go on or to turn back. One minute I would think, yes, go on, take Alice to the doctor, save her. I can't do anything for Daddy. The next second I would think, don't leave AJ alone in there to die. In sheer desperation, I leaned my head on the top board of the old gate and prayed, "Oh God, what shall I do?" My answer came in an almost audible voice. "Do the best you can with the task you have at hand." I decided the task at hand was getting my baby to the doctor to save her life if possible. What a relief it was to feel I was making the right decision. I climbed into the wagon, hit old Johnny a crack, and drove down the canyon. Cool morning breeze felt good on my hot, tired brow. It was down grade for the first miles, and old Johnny jogged along, making pretty good time. Soon, though, the sun came up over Paiute Ridge, and tired as I was, I gazed at it in awe of the beauty of that early morning sunrise. I've passed there at sunrise many times since, and have never failed to stop and take in the inspiring beauty. As I drove, the sun came up in red-hot fury. By the time I reached Warm Springs and the road turned upgrade, the heat waves were already dancing along over the sage ahead of me, like tall grain waving in the breeze. With old Johnny slowly clopping along in the sand and the sun beating on my weary back, it was then all my doubts and fears returned. Was I doing what was right? What had happened at home? I'd been gone several hours. Was Daddy dead? It seemed the wagon wheels, as they turned round and round, were beating out the refrain, "What will I do? What will I do? What will the outcome be?" Just then a strange thing happened. An old hymn popped into my mind, right out of the blue sky. "What a friend we have in Jesus." I had sung it in church and Sunday school since early childhood, but it had only been words with tunes to them. Now they meant something. Those lines, "We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer." It meant so much to me now. I know God sent the hymn to comfort me. At first the words came slowly. I had forgotten most of them. It was with trembling lips that I started to sing, and soon all the words came back. I sang it loud and clear, and all the rest of the way up the sandy grade. There's a little secret there. You can't sing and worry at the same time. I sang. At last we reached old 20-Mile House, where I could rest a few minutes, water the horse, make myself a cup of hot coffee, and eat my lunch. I hadn't eaten my breakfast before I left at 2 a.m. Now I was tired and hungry and oh so sleepy. A cup of coffee would wake me up. I watered the horse and went to look at Alice. She was asleep, so I didn't disturb her. I gathered up some chips and laid them in the stove, ready to start a fire. It was then I realized to my dismay, that I was 20 miles from a match. I ate my cold bread and butter and took a good drink of cold water and drove on. I was feeling very sorry for myself at not having a cup of coffee. I was still sleepy and beginning to nod and feared I'd go to sleep and fall off the wagon. I reached Drybone Lake, where it had been a long sandy hill going up out of the Drybone. I thought to myself, it'll take Johnny 15 minutes to climb that hill. I'll just take a little snooze while he climbs to the top. I drew Alice, still asleep, up under the shade of the wagon seat, wrapped the lines around one wrist, and stretched out on the seat with one hand under my head as a pillow. I had Daddy's watch with me and looked at the time. It was 9 a.m. I'd been on the road since 2 a.m. and had had no sleep for 3 days and nights. I must have slept the minute I laid my head down. I awoke at 2 p.m., right in the same spot I had fallen asleep. The old horse had fallen asleep too. There he stood with his nose down to the ground and his knees bent, looking for all the world like that picture, The End of the Trail. I had lain 5 hours in hot June sunshine in the hot desert. It was a wonder I wasn't sizzled all the way through. As it was, I did have a big blister on my upturned face, the big, ugly, bubbly kind that looks like a kidney. My left eye was swollen shut, and of course I was suffering from the pain of the burns. Alice was still sleeping, the first real rest she'd had for days. I was provoked at the old horse for going to sleep, and now I hit him a crack with the buggy whip, and he jogged along pretty lively for the rest of the way into town. At that, it was 5 p.m. when we drove up to Dr. Pickard's office. I tied Johnny to a telephone pole in the alley, woke Alice, and lifted her out of the wagon. It was now plain to see why she had slept so peacefully. The big abscess on her shoulder had broken open, and the corruption had run all over her. Her golden curls I had made so carefully and lovingly that morning, while crying and thinking that might be the last time I'd ever make them, were now matted down with the fluids of the abscess. It was all over her little white dimity dress. What a spectacle we must have been. I looked as bad as she, with my blister, my eye swollen shut, and my tear-stained, dusty face. I hesitated, ashamed to go to the doctor's office, but there's nothing else to do. After resting my head on the wagon wheel and crying a while, I picked up my courage, straightened my shoulders, and leading Alice by the hand, marched into the doctor's office, defying the world to feel sorry for me. Fortunately, there was no one else in the office. The doctor was in the next room. He was not only the family physician, but also an old family friend as well. He came in and, scarcely looking at Alice, stared at me. Then he put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Ms. Olds, you're not going back to that homestead. You're trying the impossible. It's beyond human ability to go out there under your own circumstance and make a living on that unimproved piece of land." The doctor had been the strongest objector to our homestead plans. "Just forget this homestead scheme. Come on back into town. You and AJ have lots of friends. We'll join together and we'll help you raise those babies up while AJ tries to get well." He had told me 2 years before there was nothing more he could do for AJ. I pulled back from his arm, saying, "Dr. Pickard, what in the world are you talking about? Of course I'm going back to that homestead just as soon as I can get there. Our school is established, we've our garden planted, and AJ is much better off out there than he ever was in town. As for me, I just got silly and went to sleep out in the desert and burnt this big blister on my face. It doesn't even hurt. I want you to look at Alice. She hurt her shoulder, so see what you can do for her." Immediately he turned his attention to little Alice, called his nurse, and said, "Give her a bath." This she did, washing her hair and even the little dress and underslip. The doctor lanced her shoulder after giving her a slight anesthetic. While she lay there asleep, her dress and the slip dried and were ready to wear again. After putting her horse up in the livery stable, we had supper and spent the night at the old Maddox Hotel, just a block from the stable. That is, we slept part of the night, for at 2 a.m. we started our homeward journey without any breakfast, for in those days you couldn't get anything to eat in Reno before 6 a.m. Johnny plodded along pretty lively, and we arrived home at noon. And happy day, both AJ and Edson were up and out to meet us. Thus ended happily the most trying experience I ever had on the homestead. I knew right then that the homestead would be a success, for nothing could ever happen that would seem any worse than that experience.